Okay, so I'm starting this in a kind of unapologetic state of rattiness because I spent half an hour recording this and it hadn't recorded. I'm just looking over now. Just let me update this. Let me refresh that and check. I'm paranoid now. Okay, seems to be actually creating a file this time. So I want to talk about Essence of Thought's response to Rationality Rules on the business of trans women in sport. So here I am. This is, you're probably getting deja vu. You're probably thinking, I've watched this video. I'm sure I've watched Noel Plum sat in his cycling gear making an off-the-cuff video about trans women in sport. Yes, that was last week's off-the-cuff video in my cycling gear about trans women in sport. This is this week's. And but it's not going to become a weekly thing, right? But I had some criticisms of Essence of Thought, and a couple of people on Twitter asked me to elaborate on that. Godless Cranium said, why don't you make a video on it? And I said, I don't think so, because I don't think my viewers are really interested enough for me to keep making videos on this subject. But this is my second channel, and what's the consequences of making an off-the-cuff video? The investment cost is very small in that. Nobody's pledging to this video. So what I want to do, the comment that I made was that I said I watched his video and I thought it sort of divided into thirds. A third of it was the kind of hyperbolic, rhetorical bollocks for which Essence of Thought is well known, whether it's about religion and the persecution and erasure of atheists, or whether it's about trans rights or gender rights and the persecution, erasure of trans people. He loves to lay it on as fucking thick as he possibly can. That is very much his modus operandi, and he didn't let us down in this video. He laid it on with an absolute fucking trowel. Good job in that regard, I suppose, if that's your thing, if that's the way you like arguments to be framed. I suppose. A third of it was what I regard as legitimate criticisms of Rationality Rules video, which I thought had some serious flaws in his video. And I will briefly discuss those on points of agreement. And then a third of it was things that Essence of Thought said which were no better than anything that Rationality Rules said. At least Rationality Rules showed that he had some understanding of sport. Essence of Thought gave me the impression that I was talking to my mum about sport, quite frankly. And I picked my mum simply because she's the archetypal person who knows fuck all about sport. And as soon as you talk to her about it, it's absolutely obvious that she knows fuck all about sport. Some of the things that I agreed with regard to Rationality Rules, I agree that he equivocated between hormonally suppressed athletes, hormonally suppressed biological males competing in a category designed really for biological females, and non-hormonally suppressed males. He talked about this, the business of trans women competing alongside biological females, but then he would give the differences between non-hormonally suppressed average biological males and biological females, and that is not a fair comparison to make. He needed to be explicit that differentiation did not apply to hormonally suppressed biological males, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about trans women competing under the present regulations. A little bit more about that, because Essence of Thought, really, that isn't really his concern, as you'll come to see towards the end of this video. But he was quite right to call Rationality Rules out in regard to that. He was also quite right to call out Rationality Rules with regard to the sensationalising of this and what's the word, sort of doom mongering or scaremongering, right? That suddenly, women's sport's going to be dominated by trans women anytime soon. It isn't. I can't see that in a million. I watch a lot of sport. I'm interested in sport. I've discussed intersex athletes in sport, performance-enhancing drugs, therapeutic use exemptions, all these things for fucking years now. Not on YouTube, because I know my subs aren't really interested in that. But these are real issues for me. Things I've took a tremendous interest in. And I know I can understand how things go, and there's not a cat in hell's chance, a snowball in hell's chance, that over the next few years trans women are going to be dominating women's sport. Why? Because even if they were not hormonally suppressed, there is not enough of them. And the vitriol towards trans women dissuades trans women from taking part in sport. There is also the factor that having gone through that transition, so you've already got a group that is numerically very low, competing against the 0.0001% genetically of biological female athletes in every discipline, effectively, which is what makes the best in the world. So even though if you looked at the tables of non-suppressed male performance and female performance, there's a shift in the distributions. It's when you take account that you're all the way down the end of that tail on the female distribution at the elite level, right? It's unlikely you're going to get that trans woman athlete who is good enough in an array of sports to see that kind of domination. You also have all the crap that trans women have to go through. You've just transitioned. We know about it. We know what the fucking suicide rates are, for crying out loud. So the idea that most trans women are going to be in a position where they are going to be devoting themselves to something like professional sport in the way that most biological females can do so is quite ridiculous, I think. It's just not going to happen at present. Maybe as things change, as trans acceptance increases in society, then you will see a change there and you will see a lot more trans women at the top level of sport, but at the present, that is unlikely to happen. And then you have this category of things which seemingly Essence of Thought doesn't give a fuck about. He talks about principles, United Nations principles of sport as a human right, the IOC as a principle of sport for all. But what about these trans women who are not competing? They commented on Rationality Rules' video. They commented in response to people like Sharon Davis and Martina Navratilova, putting their name and their picture right on their Twitter accounts to these people, saying that they have chosen, since transitioning, to remove themselves from competitive sport because they don't believe, although they regard themselves, they look down and see themselves as every bit as much a woman as a cis woman, that they do not believe that it is fair for them to compete in a category that was designed for biological females. So out of a sense of fairness, they are removing themselves from the competition. Can you see the issue there? There isn't a principle of... If you leave things as they are, then you're not getting sport for all, because there are some trans women who feel it would be wrong for them to compete. They believe that they have an unfair advantage. We could also talk about non-gender binary people and how they fit in at the moment. They don't. You have to identify as a man or a woman before you can compete in sport. Nobody seems to be giving a crap about that, which is odd. From Essence of Thought's perspective, somebody who calls himself both Peter and Ethel, that he doesn't seem to give a crap about the fact that under the present arrangement of dividing sport into men's and women's, that non-gender binary are forced to pick a side, to pick a gender identity when they don't subscribe to either of them. My suggestion does away with all of that, by the way. That is one of the advantages of it. But that's one of the problems with what Rationality Rules said. Essence of Thought was right to pick up on those points. Absolutely right to pick up on those points. They're not going to dominate sport. And the other thing was that the specific examples he chose, some of those were bollocks. And I agree with that. Especially this one about this woman in the States, this girl in the States, who she lost because two trans athletes had lost, had beaten her. Well, that's just the way it goes, you know. I mean, that doesn't mean that they weren't competing legitimately. If they were competing legitimately and they beaten her, they should still have lost. I mean, this is how affirmative action works, isn't it? There's always a fucking loser. If you give somebody the job because a group is underrepresented, we need more women, so we're going to have these 10 women, then that means there will be 10 men who don't get a job. So that's kind of how that works, really. So if you're all for affirmative action, you shouldn't be giving a fuck about this. I'm not for affirmative action, but that's just... She wasn't going to make a career in running anyway. She was going to be the 6th best in a local cluster, right? You're not going to become an elite sprinter if you're just struggling to get in as the fucking 6th best when 6 are being selected. Anyway, those are the points of agreement. There were some points where they made me cringe, a couple of these. These first two, like I said, it was like I was listening to my mum make a video on this subject. The first one was the 10 nano. If you haven't watched this video, by the way, watch it. Otherwise, you won't know what I'm talking about. He's talking about the 10 nanomole level. And the idea that the 10 nanomole level is too high, that it still gives a performance advantage over the typical women's level. And indeed, Essence of Thought quotes Joanna Harper. She's the one that did the research on distance running. And he's quite happy. Joanna Harper's obviously fine as an expert when it comes to something that suits him, but Joanna Harper advocates lowering the level to 5 nanomoles. But Essence of Thought made a big issue about this. And why? Well, you don't need to, because the medical advice for trans women is that you would go a lot lower than that it would be around the sort of 2 to 4 range. And then he went through this long and boring and tedious list of all these medical organisations and what they advocate as the limit for trans women. Like, that's an argument that somebody that knows fuck all about sport would make, as if that's relevant. The limit in sport is 10 nanomoles, apparently, at the moment. That is the limit for 12 months, right? You've got to keep it suppressed, and it's got to be down below 10 nanomoles. The idea that, well, but the medical advice for trans women is that you'd be better off at about 3. So obviously they're all going to be at around 3. Is the most naive, ridiculous. It's what relevance is that? The medical advice for biological male cis men is that you don't take EPO. It's that you don't take human growth hormone unless you've got a pituitary disorder, that you don't take insulin unless you're diabetic, that you don't take anabolic steroids unless you've had some kind of muscle wasting disease that requires you to build yourself back up again. Does that mean that people don't take them because, well, that would be contrary to the medical advice? I mean, what an absurd argument. The hematocrit, whatever it is, level was set at one point. We now have a biological passport. At one point it was set at 50%, right? And the medical advice is you leave it where it is, by the way. But it's known in cycling, there were some cyclists like Charlie Vergalius, the British cyclist, and his crit level was very, very close to the 50%. It was a constant concern for him in his cycling career. In the end, he failed a test on it, eventually cleared his name. Well, this was the days prior to biological passports. There were other cyclists whose crit levels were well below 50%, and they could dope up onto the 50% level, gain a performance advantage, because that's what a performance advantage is. It doesn't mean your level's higher than every fucker else, which people would realise that. It means it's advantageous over what your natural level would be, okay? So this business, can I just say this business that, well, it's not an advantage for a trans woman to be 6'2" because some cis women are 6'3". No, it's an advantage because if you not gone through male development, you wouldn't be 6'2", you would be about 5'7", 5'8". That's what it means. It means relative to you if you hadn't had that male development. Anyway, the hematocrit level, so they would dose up to that 50% mark. They try and surf that level, and that is part of how doping works within sport. Now, these trans women don't even have to dope. All they have to do is not do quite as much suppression as maybe they're being given, right? So just reduce it a little bit. That's not even doping. You're just taking a little bit less of your medication and just surfing just below that 10 nanomole level. I'm not going to dehumanize trans women in the way that Essence of Thought has by suggesting that they won't do this thing that all the rest of human beings do, regardless of age, gender, race, blah-de-blah-de-blah, religion, or favourite pop music band, right? Everybody does, well, not everybody does it, but people from every group do these things, especially if they are ultra competitive and determined to win. It is naive in the extreme to think that trans women will not try, performance athletes will not try and surf that 10 nanomole level. So don't worry if that level's too high, because they're only going to be at around the 3 level, because that's what the medical advice is. I mean, fucking hell, that just screams to me, I'm not interested in sport, I know fuck all about sport, when I hear somebody say something like that. The next one he said, again, it sounded like my mum. It really did, talking about sport. He talked about Hannah Mountsie and the advantages that she could have, that she had in handball, I think was her sport. And what he said is, he waves it away and says, well, but she competes in a team sport, you see. And in a team sport, tactics are important. And in a team sport, well, even if you have an advantage, you're dependent on your teammates. And some of your teammates may be weaker than some of the competitors on the other teams, so you still might end up losing. What the fucking hell has that got to do with performance enhancement and fairness in sport? Entire teams have been thrown out of competitions, been disqualified because one member of their team has failed a drugs test, for crying out loud. You go and speak to the Rugby Football Union or World Rugby, right, and you ask them what they think about that statement. They would laugh in Essence of Thought's face for making a statement like that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if one of your props, one of your front row, is on human growth hormone, insulin, steroids, right? Doesn't matter, because it's a team sport and tactics are important, and some of the other members of the team might be weaker. It's absolutely, what relevance is that, right? That doesn't stop it being a performance advantage. I just, like I say, that's the kind of argument my mum would make, quite frankly. I say that. That sounds unfair. That sounds like I'm doing the same kind. I tell you why I say that, because I am used to having discussions on performance enhancement, therapeutic use exemptions, and all these different things that are relevant to that. I've had those discussions for years. Not on YouTube, but I've had them. And I have them with people who are really, really interested in sport. And the reason they are having them is because of their love of sport and because they are obsessed with the sport that is under discussion. Usually with me, cycling. And cycling is the sport that's had more trouble with drugs probably than any other. So when I hear things like this, it's just like all the bells are ringing. That this is not the kind of argument you ever hear from people who are interested in sport. That's I suppose why I'm doing that. I'm sorry if it comes across as a little bit of a sort of an attack against the person in some ways, rather than against the actual arguments that are being made, an ad hominem, if you like. The other things were really interesting. So one of them was the distance running, right, and the research into distance running, which he brought up. He made an important point, Essence of Thought, which I agreed with, which was that if you looked at Rationality Rules hadn't really taken account of the evidence, it didn't seem. He just said what he thought would happen and conflated non-hormonally suppressed athletes with hormonally suppressed athletes. And that was a fair point. But really, you need to look at the kind of evidence that there is. The IOC, first off, is obsessed with evidence related to testosterone reduction, and only with regard to testosterone reduction. Now, I propose that is because that is the one metric that they can control. And that is shaping the evidence and shaping the way that they frame the argument, right? So this is an important point to consider, because when we're talking about what's important, I propose to you that the reason the IOC don't talk about the height advantage in some sports of biological males or the frame size advantage is not because they're not advantageous, they're not even worth discussing. It's because the IOC knows that those are things that they cannot do anything about under the present zeitgeist of men's and women's sport. So what they focus on is what they can do something about. So that's what they want to make the conversation about. So they only really talk about things where suppressing testosterone will have some effect. In terms of your cardiovascular output, your VO2, metrics such as that. In terms of things such as muscle mass, and please, Essence of Thought, don't talk about muscle density again, right? Women don't have muscles that are made of foam. The density is the fucking same. You sound like you're on some kind of bodybuilding forum where science goes out the window when you say stuff like that. But when we're talking about these things, the things the IOC are interested in are the things that they can control by controlling testosterone. I understand why they're doing that, right? That's what's under their control. But in some ways, that's shaping the debate, and then that's getting thrown back. Well, these are the things that must be important, and the other things aren't important because the IOC aren't discussing them. Just bear that in mind. When you look at Joanna Harper's research, this was the one with 8 runners, distance runners. And Essence of Thought refers to that. A lot of people refer to this because it's about all there is. Joanna Harper herself says this is pretty much all there is, I'm afraid. She sees that as a weakness. These other people that quote it don't. Joanna Harper has a magical property, which is that people will just dismiss everything she says, other than the bit that they're interested in. Joanna Harper is on record several times now of saying that trans women have an advantage when it comes to strength and size and height. On average, they have an advantage over cis women. She also says it's a complex business, by the way, because there are other disadvantages to taking those hormones, given the frames that they have and all sorts of other things. Okay, so it's complex. I'm not going to misportray what she says, and that's why it's going to impact on different sports in different ways. But she says that her research is only into distance running, and there has not been equivalent research into other sports where things like strength and power are important. You cannot ignore that. And you also cannot ignore the nature of distance running, which is what I'm going to talk about here. Before I do that, what I should say is I don't know. The 8 candidates she had, as far as I know, these were women who had transitioned. And she measured them, the performance before and after transition. If you don't understand what I mean by measurement, let me explain. They looked at their graded performance. So effectively what they did is, what percentile, in terms of their running times, what percentile were they relative to biological males prior to transitioning? And what percentage were they relative to the biological female population after hormone suppression, this period of hormone suppression? And what she found is they were at the same percentile. That's a pretty good case, that in their case, the performance advantage was entirely suppressed. That is what you would hope to see. Now, that I would have some concerns that it's a major undertaking, right? It's not like saying to an athlete, just pop this little pill and we'll see how it affects your performance. We're talking about an entire huge, overwhelming lifestyle change. People are going to refer to you possibly by a different name. They're going to refer to you as a different gender. You're going to get a lot of kickback. You're going to get some sporting kickback and vitriol. You may now be competing in leagues where a lot of the competitors, these female competitors, really object to the fact that you're competing in that. All these things are going to impact, one would presume, on your dedication to training and your focus on your training. And are difficult things to take out. What I would like to see is to get sort of a series of male candidates who would be prepared to take hormone suppression for a year without transitioning. They're still going to call themselves men. They've no interest. They regard themselves as men. They don't want to go around expressing their gender identity as women, but they will do the medical part. They would take the suppressions, they would take the hormone replacement therapy for that period and see what results from it. I think that would be really interesting. That would be a better experiment, but I accept that's probably not an experiment that's going to happen. But what is interesting is the choice of distance running. If somebody came to me, someone who has a fairly general interest in sport as well as a quite acute interest in some sports, and said, Jim, I want to do a test where we're going to look at trans women athletes, trans women sports people. And what I want to do is to show that once their hormones have been suppressed, that their performance is no better than cis women, biological females competing as women, who regard themselves as women. What sport would you recommend? I cannot think of a better candidate than distance running, because all the things we're talking about, where we're saying testosterone reduction might not affect, such as height, such as frame size, such as total muscle mass, although it'll reduce total muscle mass, unlike the first two, which it won't affect at all. Total muscle mass, it will reduce it. According to Joanne Harper, it won't reduce it to biological female equivalent levels. All of these things are not advantageous in distance running. And muscle mass is not advantageous as a distance runner. In fact, it is a disadvantage as a distance runner. Having a large frame is not an advantage as a distance runner. If you don't believe me, go and have a look at some distance runners. Right, they are generally, this is amongst the reasons why it would seem the Kalenjin, East Africans, particularly the Kalenjin, seem to dominate. They have very, very slight frames. They are short. They're very small calves, which is believed to be a factor because your calves are at the ends of your limbs and waggling backwards and forwards, amongst other physiological factors. Being tall is not an advantage. Now, I don't know whether being tall is specifically a disadvantage, but it certainly doesn't appear to be advantageous. Distance runners appear to be quite short. As I say, being large doesn't appear to be an advantage, and having a lot of muscle, having a large frame and having a large muscle mass doesn't appear to be an advantage. So, the things that appear to be advantageous, such as having low body fat because that's dead weight you're carrying, such as having a preponderance of slow twitch muscle fibers, such as cardiovascular capacity, the ability of your body to transport oxygen to the muscles, and keep the muscles fed with oxygen and with glycogen supplies. So all these things are things that we know that if you reduce the endogenous testosterone levels within an individual, that their performance will reduce. It is the perfect example that you could pick if that was the case that you want to make. Great. But at the same time, it's a really, really poor example to extrapolate, right, to sports like shot putting or powerlifting or basketball, right? These are not, or even sprinting. Now, the sprinting case, I would feel on slightly, if I had to pick one of these other sports, I'd sooner pick sprinting than shot putting or basketball or powerlifting, because maybe the loss of power is different to strength in sport as it is, as power is different to force. It's a measure of force in time, so it's how quickly you can supply that force. Power is very, very important in sprinting. Power generation is very, very important. It could be that given that you maintain a larger frame, but your power output goes down, it might not be any advantage whatsoever in sprinting, right? It might be that the test reduction is sufficient. I don't know. But you can see what I mean. It impacts on all these things in very, very different ways. And the business of distance running, if you wanted to make a general case or to try and infer things about other sports from one sport, distance running would be precisely the one you would not pick. It's precisely the one you would pick if what you wanted to show is that testosterone suppression undoes all the advantages of being male, because the advantages, the sporting advantages of being male, things that are advantageous in a lot of sports, such as height, such as muscle mass, are things that are clearly not advantageous in distance running. I hope I've explained that now. The final point that I wanted to make, I'm just hoping this is recording this time, I really am, with regard to Essence of Thought, was that I think most of his video, it was like a kind of Mott and Bailey approach that he was taking here. He's hiding his true argument, his true position, his fallback position beyond this spurious fake outer wall. And the fake outer wall is the hormone suppression is doing what it needs to do in levelling the playing field between trans and cis women athletes. But that isn't his true position. His true position clearly is that suppressing trans women's testosterone levels, their natural testosterone levels, is a human rights violation. In other words, he's saying, well, suppressing it does everything we need it to do, but actually his genuine position is it shouldn't be suppressed at all because it's a human rights violation. It kind of slips under the radar in his video, which is kind of interesting because he's actually really, really explicit in it at the beginning. He just does it in such a sort of convoluted way that you can miss it. But he brings up, the first thing that he talks about is Caster Semenya, who is, in fact, biologically, we assume she is uniquely biologically female, that she doesn't have internal testes, but we don't know that. We actually don't know that because although she's had a series of tests, the results have never been revealed. But nevertheless, we're talking about cis women here, not trans women. And a United Nations verdict sticking their oar into what the IAAF have done with regard to hormone suppression for women athletes who have unnaturally high testosterone levels. Now, let me put my hand up here and say that in some ways I side with the United Nations on this. Just let me say that with regards to biological females who are uniquely biological female, don't have internal testes producing testosterone. As far as I'm concerned, your testosterone level is your own. It is whatever it is. And if yours is higher than everybody else, well, that's just good fortune, right? It's just the same as if you were a male athlete and you had a testosterone level that was twice everybody else's in the field. Nobody would say, well, you've got to suppress it. Or whatever it is that causes Usain Bolt to be so much better than everybody else in 100 metres. We've not had to investigate that and say you suppress it. He's a biological male competing in a category for biological males, and that's all that matters, really. So I agree with that portion of it. But what Essence of Thought does, he uses that to make an argument about trans women. And what he says is the United Nations have said that this is a human rights violation against women, right? That biological females effectively should have to suppress their hormones to compete in some cases. Women shouldn't have to do it. And then he says, so the same is true of trans women, because, hey, trans women are women. So just think about what he's saying here. That isn't saying that it's okay for trans women to compete if they've suppressed their hormones. What it's saying is it is a human rights violation if trans women should have to suppress their hormones before they compete, because trans women are women, and the United Nations have said that it's a human rights violation to expect a woman to suppress her hormones before she can compete in any of your sports. It's really interesting. It's really important that you recognise that is what his actual position is. That is the argument that he was making in that video, despite the fact that he spent 3 fucking quarters of that video talking about hormone levels and how, according, in his view and according to the paltry amounts of evidence that we have, suppressing the hormone levels the playing field. In reality, his actual argument, if you could get down to it, if you could show him to be wrong, if you can show actually no, there is a residual advantage, you'd say, well, it's still a human rights violation. Trans women shouldn't have to have their hormones suppressed in the first place, okay? Which would ultimately destroy women's sport. So fuck you, actually, Essence of Thought, for that. Again, it's an argument that I've heard before. It's an argument I've heard people I know mention, but it's all people that have no interest in sport, quite honestly. It's not an argument that you hear from people that are it's an argument you hear from people who have no interest in sport, or an argument you hear from men who object to the fact that there are separate categories and really want to see women forced to compete with men and get crushed into the ground and never succeed at any sport, quite honestly. They believe that sport should be dealt with the same as we deal with anything else. That there shouldn't be a point of discrimination between male and females in sport because there isn't in everything else. That's the kind of position that they hold. And I think they hold it for all the wrong reasons there. I believe that there is an alternative to this, as you know, and I believe it solves so many of these things. It solves the bizarre scenario you could end up with, where in distance running, testosterone suppression is enough, but in the shot put it isn't. That actually in the 100 metres it may be enough, but in the long jump, because long jumpers tend to be tall, and there is a possibility that you can go for gold in the long jump and the 100 metres at the Olympics, has been demonstrated by Carl Lewis, of course, that you could be allowed to compete in the women's category in the 100 metres, but you'd be forced to compete in the men's category in the long jump. You see how complicated this is. In sports like rugby, where there are several different roles, or cricket, where there's several different roles, you could end up being allowed to compete in the women's if you're a spin bowler, but not if you're a fast bowler. That if you're one of the backs, one of the wingers, maybe you can compete as a trans woman, but you can't if you're a prop forward. I'm sure you can see the issues that we have here, right? There's such a simpler way. There's a simpler way that deals with all these things, that stops labelling people within sport according to their gender, that deals with the business of non-gender binary individuals, that deals with the business of trans women that don't want to compete because they feel that they have an unfair advantage and they're competing in a sporting category that was not meant for them. There is a way forward that acknowledges why we've made this point of segregation in the first place. There's an idea that accepts the fact that really what we're doing is the same thing that we've done with age, which is that we're not trying to protect everybody, we're trying to protect, in the case of age over 40s and under 18s, and not protect everybody. And that is the suggestion that I have made, where you have a ring-fenced category for biological females, which makes no mention of gender identity, because gender identity is not relevant to sport. And the only relevance it does have with regard to sport is to that degree with which it corresponds to biological sex. Well, if the only relevance is to what degree it corresponds with biological sex, why not go to the source? Why not go to the biological sex itself? Have a ring-fence category for biological females and then an open category for males and females to compete, for men to compete in, for women to compete in, for people who are non-gender binary to compete in. And it seems to me the only even remotely legitimate complaint you could have is that, well, that means trans women are never going to win anything. Welcome to the fucking club. That puts you in the same category as trans men, now, who nobody gave a fuck about. That puts you in the same category as all the male and female people who have medical conditions, as you have a medical condition, who take medication that suppresses their sporting performance. That means that they will never win. Right? And that's just hard shit on each and every occasion. Nobody's creating special categories for them or recategorizing them in a different group. We need to go away from categorizing athletes according to their gender identity, because gender identity is not relevant to sporting performance. What is relevant to sporting performance is biological sex. And the protected category, the group that we're trying to protect, is biological females. We don't need to talk about women. We don't need to talk about men. We shouldn't have a men's 100 metres. We should have an open 100 metres and a female 100 metres. Nobody should be forced to compete in a category that is at odds with their gender identity. I would not wish to see a trans woman being forced to compete in the men's category because she's not a man, she doesn't identify as a man, and I'm on board with that. But she would compete in the open because the open isn't claiming that she's a man. It's not claiming that she's a woman. It's not claiming that she's male or female. It's not claiming any of those things. The only thing is she's not allowed to compete as a biological female because that is a ring-fenced category. The same as under 18s is a ring-fenced category, the same as over 40s is a ring-fenced category. And we don't say, well, here's a 36-year-old, folks, who has been to see a doctor, and the doctor confirms that actually physically he's in the shape of a 45-year-old, so that's okay. He can compete in the over 40s category. That's not what it's about, folks. I think we need to look about what it's about and what solution can we employ that deals with as many of the issues as possible in as simple a way as possible. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye for now. Let's hope it's recorded this time.